recorded. So let me do that right now. Just to give everyone just a format of tonight, and then we're going to get straight into it. We're going to start with a question and answer session, and thereafter, obviously, open it up to the floor. For this stage, I've got everyone please on mute, and if you can keep yourself muted for the duration of the question and answers. And then please at the end, if you have a question, either please just type it in the chat bar, or raise your hand, your real one or your virtual one, and we'll come to you at the end to take your questions. So as I said, let's get straight into it. And again, Rolene, thank you. Now, when I contacted Rolene, it wasn't even a maybe, let me get back to you. It was absolutely yes. Just tell me when, and let me tell you, her diary is really, really full. But she was adamant she wanted to do this. She was absolutely so gracious. And thank you so much, Rolene, for giving of your time. It really is so much appreciated. And of course, we'll all thank you again at the end, of this session, which I know is going to be such an informative one. So I think, Rolene, getting straight into it, if we can. Obviously, we're speaking here about the area known as, let's call it in the media or the larger world, they call it the West Bank. We know it as Judea and Samaria. So I think even before we go into and unpack what does it mean about sovereignty, if you can maybe just give us a definition for what that area really consists of, and maybe just a historical context that led to the so-called disputed status, and maybe touch on as well, if you don't mind, just what it means, the green line. If we'll just start there, please.
First of all, I'm delighted to speak to you. I'm so happy to put some faces to some of the listeners that I interact with. And I feel very underdressed because I see you all bundled up nice and warm. And here in Israel, we are absolutely schwitzing. So for anybody who's feeling like they're missing their connection to Israel, it's very, very hot at the moment. But I'm glad that we're going to speak about this tonight because, you know, there's been a lot of discussion, especially in South Africa, around what they are calling annexation, but what we are calling the application of sovereignty. And in fact, the situation is so unique here that we don't really have a word to describe it. You know, I just want to go back a little bit and address the issue of annexation, or the word annexation. You know, according to international law, and international law is always open for interpretation, the term annex means to take land that belongs to another entity, to another government as such. But where we are very, very unique is that the land that we're talking about, which you so rightly described as disputed, is land that we kind of already control, for want of a better word, and we're going to delve into that a little bit more deeply. But we always talk in terms of the green line, what people, most of the wide world know as the West Bank. And just for many who wonder why we refer to it as the West Bank, it's kind of the accepted journalistic definition. It's kind of the easier way for people to understand what we're speaking about. Those of us like us who are in the know a little bit better know it as Judea and Samaria, Judea and the Shomron. So basically, when we're speaking about the green line, and it mustn't be confused with a proper demarcated border, what we're speaking about is a demarcation line. It's not a permanent border. Permanent borders are still up for negotiation, but the area refers to the line that marks out the Jordanian-controlled Jerusalem and West Bank before 1967. And we have three variables that shape why we call it the green line. And as you can see, I'm a Jewish woman. I speak with my hands, because if I don't use my hands, then I'll be mute. So you get a little bit of acting here as well. So when we speak about the West Bank, we're speaking about the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the area that Jordan controlled before 67, and we conquered that territory in the 6-Day War. So sometimes you'll hear the the reference to armistice line. Sometimes you'll hear the reference to green line, but it is not a final status border. The armistice line refers to that demarcation from the end of the War of Independence. And then 67, we have what we refer to as the green line. And to many of the wide world, to Israel's detractors, they call it occupied territory. We, and quite honestly, even countries like Australia refer to it as disputed territory, because it's territory that is still under negotiation, it's still under a discussion, and it's not formally run by any particular entity, which makes it, of course, very controversial.
Great. That's a wonderful intro. Thank you, Rolene. Just want to quickly, and this is, I promise, the last time you'll hear from me, except towards the end, and obviously asking a few questions. But I think it's also important from a Torah, Jewish point of view, to point out the importance of this area. So just very, very briefly, when you talk about Shomron, Samaria, that corresponds to the ancient kingdom of Israel, which is also known as the Northern Kingdom. Judea, Yehuda, corresponds to the part of the ancient kingdom of, yes, you guessed it, Yehuda, also known as the Southern Kingdom. So what happened is you got Rechavam, who was Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon's son and successor. He unfortunately did not follow in the ways of his pious father. He was quite strict to the populace, to his people, quite harsh. So the people revolted against him, and they appoint Jerovam of the tribe of Ephraim as their ruler. So what happens now is the Jewish people are split into two monarchies. You've got the northern kingdom, known as the Kingdom of Israel, or the 10 tribes, which includes the cities of Shechem and Samaria. You've got the southern kingdom encompassing the tribes of Yehuda, Benjamin, and Levi, and this area included Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. We should have touched, just highlight a few areas of biblical significance in this area, which Rolene gave us a beautiful definition of. So you've got Samaria, Shomron, and this area is mentioned in Malachim, the book of Kings 1 and 2, the book of Chronicles, as well as by many of the prophets. And indeed, the prophet Elisha is said to be buried there. We've got the area of Shechem. Shechem is situated in the narrow valley between the mounts Avel and Gerizim, which themselves have biblical significance. Shechem is where Abraham built an altar under the oak of Moreh, Elei Moreh, where Yaakov, Jacob encamped. He bought a field, buried idols. To where Jacob's daughter Dinah was raped and where she was avenged. To where Joseph is buried. Unfortunately, that's vandalized so often today. So where Joshua convened the elders and judges of Israel before his death, urging them to pledge allegiance to Hashem. And David HaMelech, twice mentions the city in Tehillim, the book of Psalms. King Rehoboam was crowned there. King Yerovam was elected there and made it his initial capital. And also Shechem is a Levitical city and one of the biblical cities of refuge. You've got Shiloh. Shiloh is such an important place. This for centuries was home to the tabernacle, in Hebrew the Mishkan, and the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron, after the settlement of the Holy Land. And it's where the high priest Eli and his sons officiated. It was therefore really the first religious center of the Israelites, to which Elkanah made an annual pilgrimage, and where his barren wife Hannah, who we read about on Rosh Hashanah, vowed to consecrate a son to Hashem, to God, if she could conceive. And after giving birth to the person that became the prophet Samuel, Hannah recited a song of praise there. We've got the area maybe lesser known, Ma'ale Lavonah, the site of the first major Maccabean battle and victory, in which Judah the Maccabee defeated the Syrian Greeks. We've got Gilgal. Just want to put on mute. Sorry. We've got the last one, just to speak about, only a few. Gilgal was the first campsite and base of Joshua and the Israelites upon entering Canaan, where Joshua erected the 12 stones gathered from the Jordan River, where the people celebrated Passover and circumcised those born in the desert. The prophet Samuel also judged Israel there. King Saul was crowned at the sacred site. The prophets Elijah and Elisha passed through the city prior to Elijah's whirlwind ascent. Gilgal was also a Levitical city in the time of Nehemiah. And again, this is just a few of the areas making part of the Judea and Samaria. And of course, most importantly, is this forms part of the biblical promise given to our forefathers, this land which is our Nachala, our Yerusha, our inheritance, the promise made to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I just want to give over to Rolene again with the question, but I think it was just important just to highlight the Torah point of view and the events that really transpired on this holy land. Rolene, so you mentioned the definition of Judea, Judea, Samaria. Maybe if you can just break it down, if you can, in number terms. So in other words, if you can tell us demographically the split between Jews and Arabs in the area.
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for explaining, you know, our inheritance in terms of Torah and Torah values, because, you know, now when we talk about the indigenous rights of the Jewish people, we tend to sometimes, and especially maybe the younger generation, sometimes get bogged down by a lot of what they see on social media, big words like occupation, and we forget the fact that Jews are indigenous to this land, and that our ties to the land go back not just centuries but millennia, and it's written in the Torah, which we read every week in Shul. So I'm really grateful to you for giving that clarification. But the last census that we had in terms of numbers of occupancy, and I mean occupancy, not occupiers, we have about 450,000 Jews around the area and about 2.5 million Arabs, most of which live in the big towns like Hebron, Rawabi, Ramallah, Jenin, Tulkarem, etc., in the area that we know as A. And believe me, I've done a lot of consulting to try and understand the maps with areas A and B and C, because it can be quite confusing.
You mentioned that, so hopefully not to really put you on the spot, but if you can maybe just go into, because we often hear about jurisdiction and who's really got control militarily or otherwise, if you can maybe just dissect that, the areas A, B, and C.
Okay, so don't worry, guys, if you're confused. I was very confused up until a little while ago. And these are areas as per the Oslo Agreement, so which is often why you'll hear Mahmoud Abbas, who's the Palestinian Authority president, who is in the 15th year of his 4-year term, often use terminology like, I'm going to throw out the Oslo Accords. So if we're looking at what the agreement said, so Area A, and I wish I had a map, but I couldn't find one that was nearly big enough, and also I'm terrible at Zoom technology and I have no idea how to share my screen. But Area A that we're talking about is completely under the control or the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. That means they are responsible for everything from a financial basis, a social basis, you know, the electricity, the sewage, etc., and security. You know, obviously, if there are issues that are a threat to our national security, then there would be some cooperation there. Area B is probably the most complex, and that is area that most of it is under the remit or the control of the Palestinian Authority. Schools follow the Palestinian curriculum, the roads, the sewage, etc., except for security. Security in that area is controlled by Israel. And then we have Area C, which is the area that's relevant when we're speaking about the application of sovereignty. This is the area that is under the full responsibility of Israel, and it includes those big blocks like Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, Gush Etzion, etc. But surrounding these big enclaves are small Palestinian villages. and those fall under the remit of Israel. They're not big cities, they're not big towns like Ramallah or Tulkarem. They are small little villages. So it does get a little bit confusing, when we're talking areas A, B, and C, but after careful consultation with an expert, I got it distilled down to as simple as could be defined, that even I could understand it.
Fantastic, because that certainly breaks it down simply, and I've got it, certainly I'm sure others as well. And so maybe just following on that, and I know maybe it's conjecture at this stage, but how those areas, those different jurisdictions, A, B, and C, likely to be affected then in any application of sovereignty?
Okay, so the area that we're talking about is, as I just mentioned, mostly going to be Area C, which is kind of already under the guardianship, the custodianship, the rule, so to speak, of Israel. So essentially, if Israel had to apply sovereignty, which we thought would happen on the 1st of July, that we would have the announcement that Israel will now be absorbing or applying sovereignty to the big enclaves of Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, and Gush Etzion, nothing really would change on a daily basis. It would probably take these areas from being disputed into being agreed upon in Israel proper. And this would also possibly, but it's still unclear, include the little Palestinian villages that surround that. And that's even quite fascinating. In fact, we had a story today in the mainstream media that 6 Palestinians were arrested by the Palestinian Authority because they happened to say on Israel Channel 13 last month, when one of the news channels did a documentary on, what do Palestinians think about this application of sovereignty. They, despite being heavily disguised, with the blackened faces and voices disguised, they said they would be very, very happy to come under Israeli sovereignty. They want to be Israeli citizens. They feel that the Palestinian Authority had let them down, that they had not received any benefits or improvement to their standard of living under the Palestinian Authority. Unfortunately, even throughout or through all the camouflage, they were discovered and unfortunately arrested. And we really hope for their safety, because it's quite extraordinarily brave of them to speak out in the media, which is absolutely contrary to what the Palestinian Authority's standpoint on this is, to say, what, if Israel's going to come and apply sovereignty, we're all for it. So nothing's really would change on a daily basis. It just would maneuver those areas more into Israel proper.
Great. So I was able to find a map, and I've been a bit more savvy on Zoom, or maybe I shouldn't speak too soon. So I'm going to try share this, Rolene. And can everyone see that? So maybe you can comment, if you don't mind, just about the Jordan Valley, and in particular, why its strategic value, why it's such a strategically important area for Israel. And maybe if you can just point out, often we forget just how small Israel is and how close, if you like, the rest of Israel, or the undisputed, should we say, is close to what we know as this area over here, as what the media call the West Bank. But Rolene, if you don't mind, just in particular, the Jordan Valley. Thanks.
Okay, so let's talk about the size of Israel, because, and I was very, very privileged to last week go up to the Golan Heights, and from the southern part of the Golan Heights starts the Jordan Valley. And sometimes it's a little bit disorientating. We're speaking Golan Heights, Jordan Valley, are they in the same place? But the Jordan Valley basically starts from the southern part of the Golan Heights and runs right down to the south of Israel into the area of Eilat. But if we look here in the map, if everyone can see me circling, it's very, very difficult to explain Israel geopolitically to anyone who hasn't been here and doesn't have a grasp of just how small the country is. You know, we South Africans know that you can take Israel and plonk the country quite comfortably into the Kruger National Park. You know, if I give a United States comparison, you can fit Israel into the state of New Jersey. So, you know, when we talk about Israel's security, we're not being hysterical as some in the media accuse us of being, but we have real concerns. And the Jordan Valley is extremely strategic to us because it starts from the Golan Heights, and it's essential that Israel has or maintains that high ground. You know, if you have been up there, you'll get a real sense of just how vulnerable Israel is to surrounding enemies. I was 500 kilometers, 500 meters away from the Syrian border. And, you know, it's quite sobering when you see, or where you can point out exactly where ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, where they have, Hezbollah included, where they have been encroaching on territory. If you know your history and you know your topography, you can see just how vulnerable the lower lands, the farmlands, the kibbutzim, etc., were vulnerable to attacks from Jordan, from Syria, and surrounds. And, you know, the Jordan River that runs up, I mean, I don't know why I'm pointing with my finger, I should be pointing with my mouse. The Jordan River, which runs up here, provides some kind of border. And if you look at the topography, there are very sharp cliffs, making it very difficult for artillery or infantry or tanks to cross. But anybody, lone wolf terrorists, small bands of terrorists, they could cross quite easily into that. From a strategic and from a security perspective, we need to maintain the area. Also, over the years, you know, this area, because it's extremely fertile in as far as farmland is concerned, and if, like me, you are partial to a really fabulous wine, maybe a whiskey, maybe a gin, maybe all three at the same time. But if you're really partial to wine, you'll see it's wine country for Israel. It's farming for Israel. The land is very rich. The soil is very nutrient rich. So agriculture in Israel has flourished throughout that land. And of course, the Middle East being the Middle East, and we have various issues around water, you've got very important water sources in that area. So that is why this area is of particular strategic importance. But if we're speaking from a defense or from a military perspective, it's that very, very strategic high ground, which is why, you know, when President Trump, and of course everybody has an opinion on him, when he announced that the Golan Heights is Israeli sovereign territory, that was very, very important and very, very significant for Israel from a military and strategic perspective.
Great. Rolene, of late in the press there's been talk of a possible fallout with Jordan if sovereignty is applied over the Jordan Valley. Maybe if you could just briefly discuss Jordan's role and what you see as the likely scenario.
Jordan's role is very interesting. You know, relations between the two countries over the last couple of years have, I won't say soured, but they have tensed quite significantly. We had the issue, I think it was about 2 years ago, with the attack on an Israeli, outside the Israeli embassy in Amman, the withdrawing of ambassadors. Ambassadors are now back. This area, which of course is very, very strategic, towards the end of last year, Jordan saying that they will not renew the lease on land that they had leased to Israel as part of the peace agreement with the two countries. It's also very tense because Israel controls about 86% of the land. But then we also have to look at what's happening inside Jordan. There's a lot of internecine fighting the people of Jordan, and especially now with the background of coronavirus, the people of Jordan are extremely unhappy with the leadership that they have. They are a kingdom, they're not a democracy, they're not a constitutional monarchy like the United Kingdom is. They are a kingdom, the king rules there. And he also needs to have control of the street. So I think a lot of the time he uses, or he has to be seen to be using very, very strong language against Israel. But it really is not for the benefit of the region or for Jordan or Israel for there to be any breakdown of the peace agreement. And what is very interesting, what has been happening over the last couple of years, and it does play into this whole issue of the application of sovereignty or annexation, is the role of other Arab countries. We're starting to see what I like to call the Arab Spring Part 2, which is Gulf states, other Arab countries, starting to move from that mindset of, Israel is the enemy to, what, maybe we disagree politically, but we have a lot to gain for the region if we start to work together. There's a lot of frustration with Arab countries, with the Palestinians because of their refusal to come to the negotiation table. And we're starting to hear coming out from various sources in the Arab world, there has to be a different way of doing things. And if any of you are on social media, in particular Twitter, it's quite fascinating to see, especially young Arabs starting to initiate conversation with Israelis. They're curious, and quite a few very, very brave pro-Israel voices. We had quite a huge turn of events several weeks ago with the United Arab Emirates and major Israeli companies like IAI, which work in defense, signing bilateral agreements to cooperate to fight against coronavirus. So we're seeing this kind of growth in the region, and it really wouldn't be for Jordan's benefit if they are to break off the historical peace agreement with Israel. Also, they look very good. When we talk about peace in the region, we often say it is possible because look what we have achieved with ourselves in Jordan and with ourselves and Egypt.
Okay, great. You mentioned Donald Trump a little earlier about his recognition of Golan Heights and Israel's sovereignty over that strategic area. Just on the issue of Donald Trump, and again, I don't know if it's possible, but if you can briefly dissect what he himself terms the deal of the century. So I don't know if this is an unrealistic task, Rolene. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but Trump's deal of the century in a couple of sound bites.
Well, I don't know if I can do it in about a couple of sound bites, and I might have to replace my water with a whiskey.
No problem.
If we're talking about that, but let's talk deal of the century. First of all, it was this deal of the century had the longest gestation period ever. We kept hearing about the announcement of the deal of the century, and eventually it came to light in November last year. But let's take a few steps back and look at the build up to his announcement. And President Trump, whatever you think of him, and everybody, of course, has an opinion. The one thing he is a deal maker. And he threatened at the beginning of his presidency that he'll be the one to bring the deal of the century. And it's actually quite pragmatic if we have a look at it and we break it down. Starting with the meetings in Bahrain last year with the Peace to Prosperity confab, with the idea there, with the aim of building Palestinian infrastructure from the ground up. In other words, to provide the financial, the economic, the social infrastructure that would help build businesses and provide jobs and provide, social infrastructure for the Palestinians. This to a lot of acceptance, a lot of fanfare, and a lot of buy-in from many countries, especially Arab countries. However, the Palestinians rejected that. They roundly reject any overtures from the Trump administration towards peace. So basically, in a nutshell, if we look at the Trump peace plan, And Israel has accepted it. A number of countries have accepted and endorsed it, including Arab and African countries, because basically the way that they look at it is, this is probably the best deal the Palestinians are going to get. We've seen so many attempts to broker peace, for Israel to sue for peace, for other countries to try and maneuver towards peace. The quartet has not been successful. UN resolutions are not successful. Maybe Trump, because he is he's somebody who is a disturber or is an agitator, maybe he'll be the one to finally broker some kind of peace. And, you know, he's laid out his plans, you know, quite simply. And, you know, he's put his deal to the Palestinians. They have rejected it, but they've rejected it without coming to the table to provide alternatives or other kinds of solutions. And, you know, issues, big important issues like Jerusalem have been taken off the table. You know, when he declared Jerusalem the capital of Israel, which we've known for thousands of years, he was doing something strategic. He was taking that negotiation point off the table and offering something else in its stead. So I've looked at it. I encourage all of you, if you can, to Google the Trump peace plan and to really read through it and to really go through it. It is very, very practical, and many are of the consensus, regardless of personal opinions about the president, that it is very, very practical should all parties agree.
Brilliant. Rolene, in terms of the deal between the Likud, blue and white, the coalition agreement, you mentioned it before that the application of sovereignty could have already taken place from 1 July. So we're now 14 July, so that's almost 2 weeks on. I guess the obvious question is, why are we still waiting? And I know that Israel's in the grip of maybe even what call it a second wave of corona. So maybe it's corona on people's mind. Maybe that's dominating the agenda. And there's talk of the need for US backing. So I saw, I think it was a report even today, that Netanyahu is waiting for the backing of the US. And the US in turn are looking for greater stability to the coalition government. Also, the US looking at possible concessions from Israel towards the Palestinians. So I guess why are we still waiting? It's post 1 July already.
Well, there's a lot of variables in the mix here. One is the coronavirus, and the Netanyahu government at the moment is under a lot of criticism from Israelis, because we've seen this surge in infections, a second wave, as you mentioned. And the feeling here is, has the Prime Minister, with his focus on the possible application of sovereignty, has he dropped the ball on dealing with the very big crisis right now, which is a coronavirus? You know, all focus needs to be there. You know, we also can't forget that he's due back in court next week for his second court appearance in his trial. And, you know, a lot of debate saying, you know, he tried to push it to the beginning of July, so that would take a lot of emphasis or a lot of focus off his trial. Also, in the government, we don't have consensus on this. I don't know who that is, but continue.
I get it in a sec. There we go. Sorry about that.
Thank you. We don't have consensus in the Knesset with moving ahead with this. You know, our alternate Prime Minister / Defense Minister / Chairman of the Blue and White, Benny Gantz, said, you know, we've got far more important things to consider. We have to deal with the coronavirus. But then he also said that, unfortunately, if the Palestinians don't come to the table and negotiate soon, you know, we're going to have to act unilaterally in some kind of way. The other issue is the strain on Israel's economy. Every economy in the world has felt the impact of coronavirus, and you know, we're no different. And also, to apply sovereignty means that we have to perhaps mobilize and train soldiers. It costs a lot of money, and it's money that Israelis feel could be spent elsewhere, like on stipends to small businesses. There is the international response to the declaration. While we've had one or two people say we support it, we've also had countries say, you know, we like the Dutch and the Belgians, no big shocker there, saying that maybe they'll impose sanctions. A lot of criticism for that. It's not a move that is supported by the majority of Israelis. Israelis feel right now attention should be elsewhere. And of course, we can't ignore the Arab world using the carrot approach, saying, you know, if you do not go forward with this, you know, we will open up more rapprochement with Israel, which will be better for Israel and better for the region in the long run. But what has been very interesting is all this talk kind of snookered Mahmoud Abbas. You know, when we were getting down to the wire, he said, no, I'm ready to come to the negotiation table. And then, of course, we had Prime Minister Netanyahu, which, whatever you think of the PM, he's the consummate strategist, and he knows how to spin issues, you know, with his rhetoric. He said, you know, Mahmoud Abbas, I'm waiting at the negotiation table. So he knew exactly how to spin whether we're moving forward or whether we're not moving forward, as you know, maybe the hard line or maybe the gracious tack. So we've had various factors that contributed to the 1st of July kind of coming and going relatively peacefully without any events.
Great. What do you make of the claim from Israeli opponents to Israel applying sovereignty? And their main claim is that it's going to endanger Israel's Jewish identity.
Well, I think that's a little bit of hysteria. I think it's also a little bit of ignorance as to how this is going to work. I don't think anything's going to erode or impact on Israel's Jewish identity. This is a country that is exceptionally proud of its Zionist and Jewish identity. I think the concern is more for our standing in the international arena, our standing in the court of public opinion, which is why, you know, when we speak about this, we've got to be careful about using the word annexation or application of sovereignty. And unfortunately, we're not very good at taking control of our narrative. Terms tend to run away with us before we can get a grip on how to explain this, how to define this. And also, it's very easy in these respects to put the blame squarely on Israel. We also can't forget that we have another side that we have to deal with in terms of negotiation, and their continuous refusal to come to the negotiation table or to even recognize the existence of the state of Israel is also a big factor in how this all plays out. You know, some of you might be very familiar with the Peter Baynard op-ed that was featured in the New York Times last week about not believing in a Jewish state, and, you know, putting all these issues out there. It's very, very easy to look at the conflict here in terms of Israeli versus Palestinian, black versus white. But this is a very nuanced, very, very, very complicated, complex, multi-layered conflict between two peoples. Where other people see black and white, we see, you know, neon green with purple polka dots, because it is that complex to try and get, you know, some kind of resolution out of.
Great. You mentioned hysteria, that maybe the opponents over analyzing, getting it wrong. But if I can just unpack that, maybe just analyze it a little bit more. What would the status? So now let's fast forward. Sovereignty has been applied over some of the areas. What then is the status of non-Israelis now being under Israel law?
Well, if the application of sovereignty goes ahead, it's probably only going to be the areas of the big settlements, so to speak. It doesn't look like, at least not for the foreseeable future, that anything's going to happen in the Jordan Valley. Many of us are of the opinion that that will probably not happen, not for a while. But should the application of sovereignty over Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, Gush Etzion take place, the Palestinians would not have Israeli citizenship. We've also got to take into account, it's not that we're being discriminatory, that we don't want them as citizens. It's also trying to show sensitivities and take into account that they, for the most part, would want to be Palestinian citizens in a future Palestinian state. This is quite an interesting exercise because it's faced a lot of criticism from Israel's right. Israel's far right have said, don't be so stupid as to annex land, because what you're doing is you're creating final borders. But absorbing these territories in you, Israel is creating final borders. And what this means is it creates a two-state scenario. So, we're getting it from all sides, from the far left who are saying, you're practicing, the A word that we in South Africa know all too well. And you're taking away citizenship, and you're making this and you're making that. And then you've got the far right here saying, are you nuts to do this? Because by doing this, you've actually created a two-state scenario. So as things always seem to be in this respect, it's again very complicated and filled with complexities.
Absolutely. So I've put you in quite a few binds. I'm going to ask you now to do something maybe you haven't done before, although in media you probably have. Just put yourself into maybe Palestinian shoes. They're saying now that any unilateral move of application of sovereignty eliminates the prospect of a Palestinian state. Knowing what we do, that Trump's deal of the century plan itself makes mention of a Palestinian state. Is this merely rhetoric on their part?
A lot of it is rhetoric. A lot of it is, conflating rhetoric to try and conflate the issues. If you look at the Trump peace plan actually makes allowances for this application of sovereignty, now with certain provisions, providing there's consensus, providing, there's agreement, etc., etc., etc. There you have to turn the argument onto the Palestinian authority or the Palestinian people and say, fantastic that you're raising this issue. Now come to the table. Bring your terms. We have to have a jump-off point or a starting point with any kind of negotiation, whether it be in business or in life, wherever, and of course here in the Middle East. If we're going to negotiate, bring your terms so that at least we've got our terms, you've got your terms, and we can start hashing them out. But you've got to come to the table. You can't use this kind of rhetoric, but not have any other kind of backup plan. And it's that reason why you are seeing the Palestinian issue starting to fall from the list of priorities of countries around the world, and including here in the region, where Arab countries are starting to feel, well, you know what, we're actually getting a bit tired of this. You also need to come to the party. And it's fascinating to watch, not only in the Arab world, but in parts of Africa, especially North Africa, North Muslim Africa, countries saying, we're tired of this conflict. We don't want to have to take sides politically. We just want to do what's best for our people. And what's best for our people is talking to Israel, but also talking to the Palestinians. So that that old era of alliances and diehard support is for the Palestinians is also starting to erode. So they also have to take that into account and say, you know what, wait a minute, we also need to maybe start doing things differently. That's why we always say we need very, very brave leaders. We need a Mandela and a de Klerk from the Palestinians and the Israelis to really sit down, as uncomfortable and difficult as it may be, and start hammering out some kind of peace negotiation.
You mentioned the reasons why we haven't, well, there's been no move in Israel post 1 July. But all practicality, there is going to be some application of sovereignty, whether it's left, whether it's right, whether it's center. I think everyone feels that there's an opportunity now under the Trump administration. Who knows what will happen after November? So maybe just the most likeliest of scenarios that are currently being discussed in the corridors of power.
Well, right now, I have to say that in the corridors of power, what's probably being discussed now is we better get the second wave under control and get it under control very fast, because it's affecting the economy and it could quite possibly affect our health system. But if we had to have those discussions, I think the only thing that would be probably a likely scenario is the three major enclaves. I don't think that any annexation of the Jordan Valley or application of sovereignty over the Jordan Valley, at least not formal application of sovereignty, will go ahead. I think that is right now, I think that would hurt Israel on a number of fronts. You know, not just the court of public opinion, but also in places like the ICC, where the Palestinians are trying to push for war crimes trials against Israel, as well as the ICC itself. It could result in an impact on our economy, and that we can ill afford at the moment. And also, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, as wily as he is politically, he knows that right now things are not looking so great for him. He's in the middle of a trial, about to go back into court next week. Right now there are protests. There's a lot of criticism against him for allowing what was a superb way of handling coronavirus to get out of hand. And this could be the end of his political career if he makes a move without the support of the people of Israel, or the citizens of Israel.
You mentioned, and quite understandably, that the focus of the average Israeli on the street right now is just returning to normal life, whatever post-COVID-19 normal is, and getting the economy back on track, defeating what may be being called the second wave. Assuming, please God, now Corona is a thing of the past, what would be, I don't know if it's easy to say, or if there have been recent polls, but the consensus of the average Israeli citizen to application of sovereignty, how should it go ahead?
Well, it's hard to tell. I think we would have to see where we stand post-corona. We would have to see where our economy is holding. You know, before going into this talk, and when we were flattening the curve, the general consensus, and according to the polls, at least 41% of Israelis did not favor this, as opposed to about 37, 39 who did. So it would be interesting to see in a post-corona scenario how this will play out. And again, it doesn't have consensus in the Knesset. It's a difficult one. I wish I had a crystal ball on this, but I think this is one of those scenarios that are quite difficult to predict.
That was my next question. Look into your crystal. No, I'm just kidding. So my last question, and then we will open it up for anyone and everyone who wants to ask a question. And it maybe goes into the area of politics more so. And you mentioned the arch chief strategist Netanyahu. But he obviously, part of his election campaign was application of sovereignty. What do you see as the possible fallout should he not deliver on his promises? Was it simply going to be that I had Corona to deal with? That was my main issue, getting the economy of Israel back on track. Do you possibly even see a new round of elections? I know that the cost to the economy of that is astronomical as well. So just maybe from my point, just to end off on this question, political fallout for Netanyahu not acting to apply sovereignty.
Well, that's quite fascinating, because we're all watching with bated breath to see what's going to happen in November next year. Because November next year, according to the rotation plan that has been agreed upon, he will step down and Benny Gantz will come into the role of Prime Minister. So let's first see if we can get that right. Please, and guys, I'm asking really nicely, no more elections. 3 in 1 year is basically our limit. I think you would have a very, very, very angry Israeli electorate if we had to go to another series of elections. Right now, the Prime Minister has 2 major priorities. He's got to get our numbers down with Corona. He's got to get our economy on a track. He's got to do all of this while going into court for alleged corruption charges. So, you know, I think that if you had to make any kind of political posturing towards election campaigning, I think it would be looked on very, very, very disfavorably by the Israeli electorate. Although having said that, this is Netanyahu. He is like Teflon. He's the consummate political strategist and orator, and it would be interesting to see how he would possibly spin that.
Wonderful. So I'm going to now open it up, and hopefully Rolene won't mind, even if you make it a bit wider. And not only, okay, I see a question coming through already. So either through the chat, or you can please unmute yourself. So again, I see Grace has actually asked a wider question. So Rolene, if you don't mind, if we can even widen up, seeing as that we've got an expert such as yourself with us, such a wonderful opportunity. So the one question is there a possibility of opening up the Gaza-Egypt border? Is that still on the cards?
I think that you, first of all, I have to give a shout out to somebody very, very special to my family, Rabbi Roddle. I see you there, and I have to give you a shout out. I'm so happy to see you there.
Likewise, welcome, Rabbi Roddle.
Very, very special to my family, and I'm so happy to see him there. And as well as some of our Mawita Chaverot and another very special person, he knows who he is, hiding amongst everybody. So I'm happy, Rabbi Richard, that we've got all these wonderful visitors to Emmarentia Shul congregation. But is the Gaza border to Egypt going to open? I think that is going to be a question that is going to have to go towards the Egyptians, how they see that scenario playing out. You know, right now, you know, any opening of Gaza to Israel is, you know, I think we've got, you know, more chances of other things happening in the world than that happening. But I think that is a consideration to go to Egypt. You know, there's also concerns from Egypt's side that there are terror elements within the Gaza Strip that they might not want imported into Egypt. Egypt also has a maritime blockade on the Gaza Strip. Egypt also has very tight restrictions and problems with tunnels from Gaza into Egypt. So while it is a question for the Egyptians, I think it's unlikely at the moment because of the level of fundamentalists or terror organizations also trying to infiltrate into Egypt.
Is anyone else, please just feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question.
You can ask a question about anything except Israeli soccer / football. That I can't give you any answers to.
When the next season of Fauda is coming out?
Oh, we've only just got Fauda 3 on Netflix here, and it's of course the top rated show. I'm trying to get over this season. It was far too traumatic for me, but I'm really excited that the world is enjoying Fauda. So are we.
Ari?
Yeah, I want to ask, good evening. First of all, thank you for giving us this wonderful talk. And Rodney, thank you. It looks like the two of you have rehearsed the questions and the answers. It was flowing very quickly. What is basically going to change? The 3 enclaves that you're talking about, they've been under Israeli control for 53 years, since 67. So if they're only going to be dealing with those 3 enclaves, what is going to change?
Well, that's a good question, and nothing really. Nothing really, except those areas wouldn't be disputed anymore. They would be under Israeli sovereignty. But on a day-to-day basis, basically nothing.
But that's exactly my point. They are not disputed in the eyes of Israel, and Israel took a stance and is keeping it under Israeli control. So what are we actually taking over again? We've had it for 53 years. The same like the Golan. We just needed Trump to underwrite the Golan. The Golan was never a disputed area. It was never going to be given back in any negotiations with any Arab country.
Well, that's where we have a lot of issues around this, is that the world doesn't really, they see it from a very superficial level. When we drill down and we look at the Oslo Accords and the territory or the areas that are under whose control, we can see, living here, understanding the situation on the ground, that not much is going to change. Just that those areas that some see is over the line and in occupied territory, or some see as disputed, will just formally be Israeli sovereign territory, and will include to be under Israeli care, or the law will be the Israeli law will be extended to those areas. So really nothing much will change, and it's an excellent example of how a lot in this area, or a lot in this region, is very, 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 very misunderstood. I see two other questions. Does Ma'ale Adumim include Kfar Adumim? Ma'ale Adumim does include Kfar Adumim. So that's the very short answer to that question.
So thank you, Leslie. And then Richard asks, what is the plan if Biden wins the election? Is Israel worried?
Oh, great question, because I know there's a lot of discussion about what happens if the Democrats win. Will Biden be the anti-Trump and undo a lot of the resolutions or a lot of the maneuvers that have been put forward by President Trump? Well, one thing that Joe Biden has said is that he will not move the embassy from Jerusalem to anywhere. But we're watching, as we do from Israel, the American elections with a lot of concern, a lot of bated breath. While we still, and I must emphasize that while Israel still enjoys very, very strong bipartisan support from both the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States, and that America is and hopefully will always remain Israel's strongest ally, I know that many people look at some of the rhetoric, especially that which we hear from the young rookies in Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. In fact, somebody asked me the question earlier, shouldn't we be concerned that she's putting forward resolutions to try and cancel aid from the US to Israel based on the issues of settlements and territory. We're all too familiar with the big mouths in the Democrats, the Ilhan Omars and the Rashida Tlaibs, but they don't speak for the whole party. And the Democratic Party and the majority of them were here last year in great support of Israel, affirming their support for Israel, maybe not as strongly as we perceive the Republican support to be, but anyone who understands the bilateral relations between the two countries understands the importance of the high level cooperation, the way we work together, Israel's strategic positioning in the region. To not understand that would be very, very naive for anybody in political leadership there. And also, we can't forget that there is always a race of power. And America is very concerned with Israel and the Chinese, any kind of relations, bilateral agreements there. That's a concern. There's also concerns with Russia and Russia's encroachment in the Middle East. So I don't think that we're particularly worried. I think that we, even if we see a change in the type of rhetoric coming from a democratic government, and it's pure speculation, America is and remains Israel's strongest ally. And, we are very, very grateful for America, for the support that we have in the region, financially, and of course, from a very, very important security perspective.
I see Tony's question, and I know Tony well, so I'm glad that he's put in inverted commas the word annexation, because I know which way he leans towards. But he's asked there, what is Gantz's take on, in inverted commas, annexation?
Well, Gantz's take is excellent. It is interesting because he is the defense minister. So any decisions taken have to, of course, include him, and he has to carry out, any of these major decisions. But his stance has been very interesting. He's very much not been that much in favor of it. There hasn't been consensus from that part. However, we've heard him also say that, but the Palestinians, by not coming to the negotiation table, are forcing us into this position where we have to apply sovereignty, where we have to take a major step in order to force some kind of scenario. So we've seen him move from, we've got greater priorities to think about, like a coronavirus, to actually saying, listen here, you guys don't come to the party, and now you're going to leave us no choice but maybe to have to act and kind of force your hand.
We'll take maybe two more. I can see one from Norman, and then if anyone wants to come with one final one. So Norman asks, and I know it's a concern a lot of people have, although I did see something which shows that the population growth is actually greater amongst the Israeli population, but Norman asks, he's concerned about the discrepancy, 450,000 versus 2.5 million Arabs. What will happen in 10, 20 years' time?
Okay, so this is an excellent question because it goes back to, the discussion, 2-state, 1-state, 3-state, no state. And this is why the scenario of 2 states is very, very heavily supported. Because if we do have a population explosion and we do have a situation where there's 1 state, we lose the Jewish majority and we lose our Jewish state, basically, so to speak. So this is why there is always a push for a 2-state solution, so that we don't have an encroachment on Jewish demographics. It's the demographic time bomb that we talk about. Having said that, the majority of Palestinians live in the big towns that are governed by the Palestinian Authority. And this is why this issue is so complicated, because what is the best scenario? We have our historical and ancient ties to the land. They're indigenous people. However, we have a potential demographic time bomb. We have a situation where 2 people have to become very amicably divorced, or at this stage just divorced, and each has to take on their own national responsibility. And then there's the other question: do Palestinians really want a state of their own? Because that changes the rules, that changes the game. They have to be responsible for issues of incitement, where the money goes. They have to be accountable. And at the moment, they like to play on sympathy, because that means they don't have to be accountable. So yeah, it's a very, very, very loaded question, and one where we have to consider, is the 2-state solution still alive? Because if it's not, we could have a situation where we find ourselves in a demographic time bomb.
Well, one final question, and I say final, I'm sure Rolene's happy to stay longer, but let's take into account it's an hour later. Rolene's been so gracious with her time. So Grace asks a question, and it's a great one. Is Trump's concern over China limiting or having any effects of Israel's trade with China? Was that not part of why Pompeo visited, even though it's purported to be about security? China is a large trading partner with economic cooperation. Yeah, so just Israel maybe having its hands tied with regard to China?
Oh, absolutely. Grace hit the nail on the head where she said, wasn't that Mark Pompeo's the reason for his visit? He did come in a lightning quick visit with his lovely mask, and everybody should be wearing a mask. He did come into the country, and what we don't know the entire details of what happened with his meeting with the Prime Minister, and of course with Benny Gantz and the Foreign Minister Ashkenazi. But we do know that China was very much on the table, and shortly after that, a tender to manage the port in Haifa, which was on the cards to go to China, went to a local Israeli company. So I would imagine there are a lot of incentives and possibly very, very diplomatic warnings towards Israel. Listen here, we're facing off against China, and not to Jewish guilt you or anything, but don't forget who your big ally and trading partner is. We have seen an encroachment of China all around the world, and including two of our major brands here, Tnuva, Ahava, are now Chinese owned, and there are concerns, that we also can't lose our Israeli brand identity by allowing for Chinese buyout. However, we still cooperate with China. We've especially cooperated with China in trying to fight COVID-19, but we've also got to remember, where the alliances lie. So great question.
And on that, we'll close. I just want to again thank Rolene. Thank you so much. I look forward. I hope it will be possible to engage with you in the future. Wish obviously that you keep safe, you stay well, indeed the entire Israel population, in fact together with the entire world. All those who are ill, sick should have a refuah shalema, be healed speedily, completely. This corona should go away, allow us all to do what we need to do. But Rolene, please God, we can engage with you in the future once indeed the pandemic's over. Israel's able to go down to get back to its business, the business of the day. And just again, thank you for being so gracious with your time, so hospitable, and thank you so much on behalf of all of us.
It is my absolute pleasure. Any time for you guys, I'm happy to jump on, even if it's past Dudu's time. Listen, I go to bed at like 7 o'clock at night, so let's not kid. But it's been my absolute pleasure and my honor to speak to you all. I wish you all continued safety. Please stay healthy. Please stay safe and warm. And I look forward to seeing many, many of you in the future.
Thank you. And have a good night, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. Well done.